There's these themes that have this golden thread of commonality throughout the ancient tradition. We'll see things that kind of pop up in the Book of Mormon, but he's talking to people that have very specific, rigid views.
And have, right. Well, and maybe you do. Maybe this is an issue that you are struggling with, is you're like, man, I don't know how to reconcile the Garden of Eden and evolution. Choosing your order. Yeah, those are related words, actually. It's the study of the structure of the universe.
Hence, we infer that God had materials to organize the world out of chaos, chaotic matter, which is element, and in which dwells all the glory. Element had an existence from the time he had. The pure principles of element are principles which can never be destroyed. They may be organized and reorganized, but not destroyed. They had no beginning and can have no end.
How can we not just add this to the Pearl of Great Price?
You can if you put it and you copy and paste it and stick it in your scriptures.
Okay, yeah, let's get into this. Welcome back to the Sticky Joseph YouTube channel. Today we are trying something new. It's called We Don't Know Yet. It's a book club or a book review or reading books with Dave Butler, Mike Day, Dave Butler. We don't know yet what the title is going to be. We want your help doing it. But what's going to happen is they're going to go through their repertoire of books that they have read that have helped them understand the scriptures, and they are going to share that with us to hopefully, for those that don't have the time to read those books, to glean the knowledge that come from them. But those who are also just looking for good books to study, they can grab from this library that we're going to get over time. And this isn't a Hayden and Jackson show. This is a Mike Day and Dave Butler show. They're running it. It's really awesome. Real quick before we get into it, if you have not yet got Dave Butler's book, In the Language of Adam, you are missing out. It has 10 hours of bonus footage. When you get the physical copy, you also get access to the audiobook as well. And so if you want to get this book, which I highly recommend that you do, link in the description. Let's get to the video.
Hey, welcome to the Stick of Joseph. We're going to do something kind of weird today. We were thinking about doing this.
Actually, do it again.
Okay,
do it on this camera.
Okay. Hey, guys, welcome to the Stick of Joseph. Mike here.
Dave here.
Yep, and the Paul brothers.
What's up?
We thought it would be really interesting to talk about some books. Now, this is kind of our idea. Now, tell me if this works. Dave and I thought we would sit and talk about some books that we find interesting over time, and because here's the deal. Like, when you're a teacher, one of the things that is important to know is that a good teacher wants to save their students time. And so you don't necessarily have all the time to read some of the stuff that Dave and I are into because, frankly, we're kind of weird.
Nerds.
Is that fair?
Absolute nerds.
I'm extraordinarily weird.
Yeah, we're kind of different. And so the deal is we'll save you time by reading this stuff, and then we'll talk about it. And then I think that if you like what the book talks about, then you'll check it out. And if not, you'll be like, oh, cool. I had like a 1-hour synopsis of John Walton's The Lost World of Genesis 1, which is what this is right here. So once again, we want to save you guys time, but also talk about some really interesting things. This is kind of like Sunday school out in the hall. I don't know if that's a good way to put it.
I like that.
Out in the hall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Foyer Sunday school.
Show them the book, Dave, because I have mine on my iPad.
Yeah. So the idea is sort of one book, or maybe conceivably it could be one or two books at a time, right? And we don't have a name for this segment, and frankly, we won't do it if you are not interested. So if you enjoy what we do today and you think, oh, I would like that, I would like once a month or something to see Mike and Dave and some attractive young people sit down and talk about, one at a time. Part of the idea is to introduce you to important scholarly texts. Here's a story. I was telling this to Hayden earlier. I remember, I think it was 2000, okay? I could be off of one or two on the year. And I was living in London, and it was a New Testament year, and I was trying to figure out, I was riding the train a lot. What New Testament scholarship should I read? And Farms had published a list of recommended books, but all it was all the New Testament stuff published by Farms, plus one or two other things. It was not very helpful. So the idea is to, yes, summarize. So if you can listen to an hour podcast discussion but not read a book, great, no problem. We'll tell you what's in the book and some key ideas that are interesting. And if you are trying to build a library, think of us as a kind of a guide, right? We're not reviewers. We're not going to read bad books and go, "Oh, this is terrible, 0 stars." No, we're gonna read 5-star books only, with our decades of experience, and I think some of them will be written by Mormon scholars, but I think my gut is that probably most of them, but certainly many of them, are going to be written by, as today's is, by non-Mormons, right?
You know, Dave, one of the things I think is interesting about this is there's a lot of bleed over. And so in scholarship, you start looking at the terrain and you start to see themes that pop up. And so we'll see in Walton's book and others that there's these themes that have this golden thread of commonality throughout the ancient tradition. We'll see things that kind of pop up in the Book of Mormon, because I really love your approach to the Book of Mormon, but wouldn't you say that reading scholars outside of the LDS tradition has helped you to gain greater appreciation for actually what's going on in the Book of Mormon text?
Oh, 100%. And I think that the goal is not to go look at a bunch of Gentile books and say, what here proves my point of view? The goal is to say, hey, what are the uses and abuses of scholarship, right? How should I read? This is like a meta point. We're going to talk about, individual books. What's in this book? Why is it interesting? But I think the meta point is, well, what kinds of things can I get out of scholarship, right? The answer is not, oh, read their conclusion, the conclusion must be true, right? The answer, we're going to see this over, I think, many discussions, is what are the kinds of questions they're asking? How do they ask them? What kinds of evidence do they consider, right? So I think of this as, yes, executive summaries if you don't want to read, but also a guide to how to build your shelf, and also maybe kind of a guide to how to approach scholarship and ancient scripture over time. So again, if you like this, if you enjoy it, like, reshare, do the things, right? Also, we don't have a name for this.
Yeah, so
I think
share it. Share a good name. If you have, we want the audience to decide.
I have a suggestion. Mike and Dave read books, but that sounds maybe pretty bland.
Mike and Dave read books.
Yeah, so let us know in the comments.
It makes it clear, though, that you guys know how to read books, though, which is good.
Exactly.
About Mike and Dave and attractive young people read books.
That could get the people in. Any excuse that we have to bring these two guys into the studio, we take full advantage. And one thing we want to emphasize is all these books that they're going to be presenting to you, like, we don't have any sponsorship or ties to these people, except for the fact that these books were integral into them gaining how much knowledge they do about the ancient world as they do now. And so we're super excited. So the book today, The Lost World of Genesis 1 by John Walton.
Yeah.
Now
Let's
teach
get
us.
into
Now
this.
he calls a lot of the books, he'll do The Lost World of, and then it will be The Lost World of such and such. What really got me on John Walton was The Lost World of the Israelite Conquest, because I was trying to do a deep dive on Joshua, and I knew that I was just going to get hammered by my students with the question,
Like, what,
dude,
why
why
are
is
they
Yahweh
all these
killing
people?
everybody? Yeah, like, what's going on? And I had read other people, but I wasn't really satisfied. And then I read his Lost World of the Israelite Conquest, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And then I just started reading all the Lost Worlds, because, as you can see, they're skinny books.
Yeah, there's fewer than 200 pages. It's a short book.
That's awesome.
In fact, from my point of view, well, let me tell you. So I reread this last night. I read it back in 2011 or something. No, it's really short. Look at it.
I know, it's short.
It's
yeah.
a little short.
The footnotes are like a big part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like 150 pages, right? Like literally, and they're not heavy, dense pages, and it's written for the general reader. Okay, so by the way, like an initial, just high level takeaway, if you want a way to sort of start to dip your toes into biblical scholarship, this is maybe an interesting way to do it for that reason. It's clearly written not for the dust-covered bifocals wearing scholar in mind, right? But just for the average, reasonably educated person. So the interesting thing to me, I had forgotten this about this book, is it's written to participate in the debate about creationism. Okay. The overall argument of the book is this. I'm going to summarize it, Mike. You tell me if you think I'm getting this wrong. You're going to nail Okay. So the overall argument is this. Hey, Genesis 1 is not meant to be an explanation of the creation of the material aspects of the world. It is derived from, modeled on the science of its day, which I don't think he ever specifies when he thinks it is, but I think Court of Solomon is kind of the common guess, right? Something like that, 10th century BC. It does use the science of its day as kind of a framework, but it's not trying to explain where the physical world came from. Therefore, there's no problem taking seriously any scientific theory coming out of geology or cosmology or evolution, and also taking Genesis 1 seriously, because Genesis 1 is talking about something else, right? That's the overall argument. Now, to me, interestingly, so what is Genesis 1 talking about? He says it is a temple inauguration text. So the book has 18 chapters. He calls them propositions. It's great. I don't know if all the Lost World books do this, but he says, here's what I'm going to tell you in this chapter, right? And it's an argument statement. And then he 8 pages or so, talks through the proposition. Frankly, for me, the best part's over by page 100, because the last third, what he's talking about is like, it's okay to believe evolution, or take that seriously as a theory. It's okay to take seriously plate tectonics and stuff. I never had a problem with any of that. So, like, for me, the last 50 pages are like, okay, yeah.
But he's talking to people that have very specific, rigid views.
And have, right. Well, and maybe you do, right?
Yeah.
Maybe this is an issue, this is my point. Maybe this is an issue that you are struggling with, is you're like, man, I don't know how to reconcile the Garden of Eden and evolution.
Science.
And maybe that 50 pages will be really important to you.
And Mike, that's kind of you. You're kind of in that space a lot. From the time I've spent with you, you're kind of in the space where you're like, you're trying to see how this all fits together, right?
So the last third for me was important because, at least initially, the first time I read it, I've gone through the tunnel, like the pit of despair, and then the dark tunnel, and then I've come out.
Yeah.
And so on the other end of that crisis, I've come to this great, beautiful place where I'm like, I'm totally fine. I'm in Dave's boat where I'm like, I'm totally fine with however it happened. But, and I call this like creation, fall, atonement. Like when you're in the creation state, when you're in the garden, everything's awesome. Everything in the scriptures is 100% literal. It happened. The prophets are always doing great things. Everything is true that's written on the page. And then you have a fall experience. You eat this fruit and you see things differently. And people your age, generally your generation, and I never know what the correct label is, and so I'm not really into labels, but younger folks.
Just say you people.
You youngins, you see something on the internet, or you talk to a historian, or you just are introduced to something that changes the way that you view things. And you realize, wait, everything that I thought isn't necessarily the way it is. And so some people leave the church, or they do a TikTok and they're like, I'm out. I just learned Brigham Young did this, or I learned that there was a lot of death long time ago and I'm out. And I saw a dinosaur fossil and I'm conflicted. Yeah. And then,
which is comic, except it's not. It's sad because because people really do have these traumatic experience.
Yeah.
Sure.
And so they're in different places. And so when I talk to my wife about this, because I'm always thinking, how do I teach this? How do I approach this? She always tells me, Mike, be aware that there's some people in the garden and there's some people who've eaten the fruit and they're really troubled and they're seeking help. And you've got to talk to both. And just because you're over here in this new state where you're like, I'm totally okay with it, they may not be. And so I'm with Dave where I'm like, however the creation happened, I'm chill. I'm totally fine. If it's true, I believe it.
Yeah. Here, I have a question about that, and I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but do you think more the burden on reacting well, like how do we teach young people about the gospel, that it's not all sunshine and fairy tales, in a way that allows them to learn faith promoting things, but also have a reality check? And so they don't like just stay in the garden until one day that they're on their own and they're 27 years old and then they find out something that they never knew.
Because that's the story of Peter Pan. It's the boy who never grew up. And we can do that with our faith, and nobody wants to hang out with Peter Pan. And when Peter Pan has kids and his kids are starting to grow up, they'll start to disrespect Peter Pan because he never grew up. You know what I mean? And I think that's what happens a lot of times. We never grow up out of the primary understanding of, and by primary I mean like little kid Sunday school understanding of things.
Pamphlets.
Yeah. So, I mean, in that story, you have the clock, and then you have the dragon, and then you have Captain Hook. And those are archetypes for facing the dragon, and then facing the reality of time, like I'm changing. And then Captain Hook is what happens when you're bitter and you eat the fruit and you're like, I'm going to burn the garden down because the garden must not be true. And the key is to get through that.
Yeah.
And so I think in answer to your question, like, what do we do? How do we address that? Was that your question?
Like, how do we teach the gospel in a way that
how do we teach it? Yeah, that's the question. So two things, in my opinion, as a teacher. One of them is this. I had a historian from the Joe Smith papers, and he came and talked to me, and he said, one of the dangers of church history is not knowing enough. You can never know too much church history. Now, this isn't a discourse on church history, but some people learn a little bit of church history and then they fly off the handle, or they read one book and they're like, now I know the truth. So know the history. And then the second thing is read scripture. Like, really read what it's saying. And I think that's what John Walton's doing. He's really analyzing Genesis 1, and he knows the language. And he says, and he says it on one of these pages in here, if you want to know what the word means, it's good to know what it means in English. But what did it mean in the minds of the person who wrote it? And that's where it's a challenge amongst LDS people, because we have limitations, don't we?
Yeah.
We have linguistic limitations. And so we know English, or we know whatever our native tongue is, and we haven't read the text in the original. And so, and this is a danger, right? Because we don't want to set up priestcraft where we have a series of scholars that know the language. But in the words of Brigham Young, he said, if I knew the language of the original authors, I would be duty bound by God to be able to translate it in the language that they could understand and teach the people. Like, he literally said this, like, if you know it, it's incumbent upon you to teach it. So I think that's another thing that I appreciate John Walton doing, where he gets into, okay, what's going on with the word create? Bara. And then he breaks it down in the book. There's a table where he's like, here's the times it's used in the Bible. And it literally is a divine organization that gods do. It's a specific word. That word translated as create. And then he has a whole chapter where he says, create doesn't necessarily mean create. Now, he's not quoting Joseph Smith, but he's quoting Joseph Smith, where he says it's organizing.
Okay, yeah, let's get into this. Let's start getting into it. First, before we get into create, I think that's a great subject to start in. Dave, I want to ask you, for the subtitle of the book is the, what's the subtitle again exactly?
Ancient Cosmology and the Origins Debate.
Do we define cosmology?
Yes, that's what I was going to ask. Dave, could you define what cosmology is? And
Well, it's makeup. No.
It's makeup. Yeah, that's what most people are going to think.
Those are actually related, though.
In Greek.
Cosmos, yeah, they're basically from the same Greek, same Indo-European root. The cosmos is the universe. So cosmology is words about the universe or study of the universe.
By the way, the cosmos also is order. So
Yes.
when you put on cosmetics, you're putting your face
You're
in
ordering
order.
your face.
Yeah, okay.
In order or in a completely
In
different
an
order?
order.
The order that Rihanna says you need to put it in,
You are
because she will sell it to you.
You're choosing your order. Yeah, those are related words, actually. It's the study of the structure of the universe. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's get into this creation thought too. I love that you tease that. Dave, what does John Walton talk about, like say about creation in this book? Because this is what identifies us or delineates us from the rest of Christianity, is we don't believe in a ex nihilo creation. For those who don't know what that means, it just means out of nothing. So we don't believe that God created everything out of nothing. What does John Walton say the nature of creation is according to Genesis 1?
So this is really interesting. And there's like a meta point here, and I'm probably going to overuse the word meta in this segment, so sorry.
Not sponsored by Facebook.
One of the interesting sort of takeaways you have reading this book is definition. How do I learn what the definition of a word is, right? And in modern English, right, if I don't know a word, I go look up in a dictionary and go, oh, that's the word, right? Well, no ancient Hebrew wrote a dictionary for us, so we don't have that option. So how do you figure out what the meaning of a word is? Well, the answer is you go look at all the appearances and you go, what does it seem to mean in all of these contexts, right? Which is what makes it tricky if a word only appears once or twice, right?
By the way, tell him the name of that when it only comes up once, because I love when you say it.
Is a hapax legomenon.
That's just so cool.
Yes, great.
So if you want to have a really cool conversation, impress people at dinner parties, you could start quoting Isaiah's hapax legomenon.
Hapax legomenon. So we have to be careful with assuming we know what it means. So he does. He goes through, for example, the second word in the book of Genesis is bara. Bereshit bara Elohim. So bara is translated as created in the King James translation. So his question is, well, what does it mean? So I think it's 50. He goes through the 50 occurrences.
He starts this, if you're interested and you have the book, it's on page 42 where he starts, and then he gives the chart where he talks about how many times it's used.
And it's in proposition like 4 or 5 or something.
It's the chart.
Or is it earlier than that?
Chart's on page 39.
Okay.
Starting on 39, and it goes for like 2 pages.
So and so he says, look, and I'm going to take his. He addresses these in different order, I think, but he says some people have looked at this list of words and said there is never an indication of the material out of which things were made. Therefore, bara means to create out of nothing. He says it is true there is no indication out of the material out of which these things were made. He said, but that's not. He says I don't think that's the key thing we should notice. There are 2 things he wants us to notice. One, Mike already said this: the agent, express or implied, is divine beings. So bara does not mean. So there are actually 2 verbs to make or create in Genesis 1. The other is asa, which is a very general word that means to make or to do. Okay, and a human being can asa something, but human beings in the Old Testament do not bara anything. That is something gods do. Okay, so 1, divine agents. The second thing he says, this is, I think, sort of the key point of his argument, really. The book, a lot of it hinges on this, is bara does not mean to make the materiality of a thing. Okay, it doesn't mean to make a substance. It means to create, to give something functionality, to make something function, to make something do something.
And he gives good examples, doesn't he?
Yeah, so let me give you an example. So he says he divided the darkness from the light, and he called the light day, right? Called the darkness night. So,
And he does this before the sun's made. Which, because the Westerners read this and like, this is gobbledygook because the
Yeah.
sun's not even made and he's dividing
always
light.
been something that's
But
been weird
back
to
to
me.
the point, yeah.
well, I mean, yes, and he talks about that. So the point is, the interesting thing here is not that light is the substance as created. The interesting thing is that the function of day is created, okay, and the function of night is created, which is to say this is the creation of time, okay? And he says,
In other words, God's outside of time and he's creating time. I mean, that's one of the ways to look at it, or ordering it, would you say?
yeah. So his argument is, and he says this explicitly, is this is not about, we don't know about, it may be creation ex nihilo, but we don't know about that. That's not what this is saying. Really what we're saying is God is giving things function here. And his argument is that day 1, 2, and 3 are about creating function. Day 4, 5, and 6 are about setting functionaries to govern the system. So, to me, one of the interesting things, and maybe not the most interesting thing, but that is that, the people writing this text, the author or authors, took the science of their day and they said, look, God set this up to do something, to accomplish something,
Purpose.
a purpose, and that purpose has to do with Adam and Eve, right? I mean, what is the function of the cosmos? This is a story that sets Adam and Eve at the center by saying God has turned formless chaos. He interprets the word tohu, which is translated as without form in the King James, and says actually it means without function.
Tohu wabohu.
Tohu wabohu.
Without a function, disordered. I have a really great picture of my son's bedroom when he was in high school. That literally is the embodiment of tohu wabohu, complete
Chaos.
disordered and chaos.
Yeah.
That's
filled
funny.
with all kinds of. To me, tohu wabohu is filled with the building blocks of matter, but it's a complete mess.
Sounds like my brain.
Yeah, and bohu only appears. I think he says 3 times in the Old Testament. So that what is thrice in Greek? Is it trees? Is it a trees legomenon? Maybe it is. So,
Clark Kellogg, I got to just jump in here. Clark Kellogg during the NCAA tournament used tohu wabohu in his commentating of a game. As he watched the offense, had no plan. It was completely disordered, and they were completely just confused. And he said, on air, he said, "This offense is tohu wabohu." And the other commentator looked at him and said, "What are you talking about?" And then he went off for like a 30-second discourse on Genesis.
of form and void.
It was awesome. Yeah.
That's awesome. Hilarious. Yeah. So if bohu only appears 3 times, we can't get much meaning from it, so we have to look at tohu. And he says what it means is not having functionality, inert. So he looks at all the examples, and what are the things that are tohu? It's things like deserts that are not providing food, okay, or places that have been wasted in war, I think, okay. So so without form and void is inert, not doing anything. So this is an idea about God creating a system for, in some sense, Eve and Adam, and Again, I don't think that's the most interesting thing he says here. It is a very interesting thing.
I want to just comment a little bit on ex nihilo because he mentions it in here where he says, bara, I'm just going to read a little bit here from 42. He says, to expand their reasoning for clarity's sake, since create is a material activity assumed on their part, and since the context never mentions the materials that are used, as demonstrated by the evidence in the text, then the material objects must have been brought into existence without using other materials. That is, out of nothing. But one can see that this whole line of reasoning only works if one can assume that bara is a material activity. So here's what his point is. He says, listen, the bara-ing going on, it's really more of an organization or giving things function, naming them, dividing them. And this is not a text on material creation. Now, he doesn't do this, but I'm just going to say this. The whole idea of ex nihilo comes in Christianity in the 2nd century. There were a couple guys in 160 AD that had this debate, and it was developed further by a couple guys named Tertullian and Origen. And this was basically their bit. This is like their argument. It basically came down to this. Their belief was, since God is sovereign, everything must be under God. And so if there's something that's made, if there's a rock or a tree or a stone or a world or a cosmos, and God is sovereign, he's really in charge, then he made everything. And then the question is, well, what made the thing that made the thing? And it's turtles all the way down. In other words, this idea of like, well, what made the thing that made the thing? Well, it had to be God. Well, what made
God?
And so and we keep going down. Now, the turtles stop with God. Like to them, there's like there is no God. Now, in the Latter-day Saint culture, we would say, well, there is a Father of Heavenly Father, the King Fault Discourse, which I hope one day we do.
I'm going to read a section out of it after this.
Okay, but I hope one day we do a whole thing on it. Like that would be so cool to go into the biblical evidence, to talk about this. I'm sorry, I'm just going to riff here, but it would be so fun to nerd out sometime and just go, okay, let's look at the creation accounts of all these different cultures, like the Theogony and the Enuma Elish, and look at some of the stuff that's going on in Egypt and see how they viewed it. But to the Christian mindset, since God is sovereign, then everything must have, logically to them, it must have been made out of nothing. Now, that's not going on here, and it's not stated in their text, but they're using the logic of their day to try and figure things out. And so when philosophy and scripture kind of blended, sometimes we lost things in translation. And so Joseph Smith will stand up and say, God,
and this is what Joseph Smith says. I have it pulled up right here on April 7th, 1844, just a couple months before he was killed. It says, you ask the learned doctors why they say the world was made out of nothing, and they will answer, doesn't the Bible say he created the world? And they infer from the word create that it must have been out of nothing. Now the word create came from bara, which does not mean to create out of nothing. It means to organize. The same as a man would organize materials and build a ship. Hence we infer that God had materials to organize the world out of chaos, chaotic matter, which is element, and in which dwells all the glory. Element had an existence from the time he had. The pure principles of element are principles which can never be destroyed. They may be organized and reorganized, but not destroyed. They had no beginning and can have no end.
Dude, how can we not just add this to the Pearl of Great Price? Bro?
You can if you put it and you copy and paste it and stick it in your scriptures. I'm just going to say
all those blank
this.
pages in the back.
Yeah, and I'm not making any money off this, but this is how I do my scriptures. I like to do the pages, but then I can add stuff. This is called GoodNotes, and it's a really cheap app.
Okay.
And I paid for it one time. I think I paid $4, but I do my translations in here. Anyway,
So you have your own Mike Day
your own
scriptures.
I'm a complete
Translation.
nerd, but I'm always throwing quotes in there because as a teacher, someone will ask me something and I'll kind of summarize the quote like I do with you guys where I butcher it. But when I'm teaching it, I have it all prepared and it really helps. Now, can I just say this? This is why it matters. Like you may sit here and go, okay, we just had a
ton.
We just had a 5-minute conversation about ex nihilo. Who cares? I don't even know what ex nihilo means. Once again, out of nothing. Here's, in my opinion, why it matters. If God created everything out of nothing, the early Christians thought, okay, then what do we do with the problem of evil? And the answer is because God is sovereign. If it's evil, God did it.
Made it.
God
Bastard.
made it.
Yeah.
Now, there's some stuff even going on in the text that talk about this, but this idea comes into being with this word that we call Calvinism or predestination, which he's actually getting it from Augustine. Augustine kind of wrestled with these ideas. But what the Latter-day Saint position is talking about, this is not in Lost World, so I'm kind of going off the reservation. But what the Latter-day Saint position is we kind of inject to this idea of there's this intelligence, whatever that is, and it's clothed and it's turned into a spirit. And there's some spirits that gain bodies that make bad choices and some that make good. And if you do something really horrible, it's not that God did it, because you are an agent. This is a radical shift from the sovereign God that made everything, because if he made everything out of nothing, then we have to blame evil on God. And I think that's a wrestle that Joseph had when he was 12. He's sitting in church next to his mom, and he's hearing these sermons, and predestination did not sit right. And so I think he's wrestling with this, and when he learns Hebrew when he's in Kirtland, I believe his mind is open. Now, it may have been open before, but I know then he's talking like this.
Dude, can you just walk through? I've heard you do it a couple times, like go down the logical route of why that means that if someone believes in ex nihilo creation, then agency
doesn't
makes
really
no
exist.
sense.
Yeah, so the way I understand it, and I'm sure someone could probably find a way out of it. I don't have perfect reasoning, but the way I look at it is if God is omniscient, knows everything from the beginning to the end, if he created everything out of nothing, at the moment of creation, he knew exactly how the attributes of that thing would play out over time and how it would interact with the attributes of others. And even if he created some sort of abstraction called free will, he knew exactly how that free will would have been used based on the attributes that he gave that thing that he created. And so free will in a world of ex nihilo creation is merely an illusion. And that's where like some of the new atheists, like the big atheists like Sam Harris, even Richard Dawkins is kind of in this camp, get their ideas from. Ex nihilo creationists essentially align with atheists, with some of these new atheists that believe that free will is
plus
nothing.
Omniscience, right?
Plus omniscience. That's the
plus
huge
omniscience.
That's the huge
puts you in a terrible
issue.
bind.
So one other thing I want to point out here, and I would love to do a deeper dive on this, and maybe I will, but what Joseph Smith puts forward, April 7th, 1844, is the law of conservation of energy, the first law of thermodynamics, which is essentially matter cannot be created nor destroyed. It just changes into different forms of energy. That's what he says. He says element and everything is eternal. Now, the Law of Conservation of Energy was published the first time in 1842 in a scientific paper in Germany. So I have no idea, like, when did the Law of Conservation of Energy make its way into the United States and to Nauvoo? Because it would be really interesting to do an analysis of this, because if it hadn't made its way to Nauvoo at that point, Joseph Smith came to the conclusion that very brilliant people spent years and years diving into. And I mean, also, I would wonder how many Hebrew scholars at that time are saying that barach means to organize instead of create.
Well, and that's what Joseph's example, right? Joseph's example is a ship, which is a supremely functional thing.
Yeah.
Right? So it's an interesting kind of point of alignment with Walton's book here. On the subject of I'm going to go a little further off the reservation.
But wait, that's where the fun is, right?
Yeah. Okay, so here's something interesting. So I think I read this in Aryeh Kaplan's edition of the Sefer Bahir. I go back and double check.
I'll correct you.
Okay, thank you. Which is a very old Jewish mystical text. The three great Jewish mystical texts are the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation, the Sefer Bahir, the Book of Illumination, and the Zohar. So I think it's in the Sefer Bahir that says that some rabbis read Genesis 1 as follows. The subject of the verb bara is not Elohim. It is unexpressed. Grammatically in Hebrew, like in Spanish, you don't have to even necessarily say a pronoun. The verb itself implies a third-person singular actor. So that what is the function of the word Elohim in the verse? Elohim is the first object. So that the reading is Bereshit, in the beginning, he created gods, the heaven, and the earth.
It's a different reading.
It's a different reading.
Really? So there were Hebrew.
Yeah. So this is
rabbis.
I think that's in Sefer Bahir. I could be wrong.
But they're having these conversations like, what does that mean?
Right. And so who is the he? It's the Ein Sof. It's the endless. It's the manifestation of God that is without a creator and in the beginning. Yeah. So anyway, there have been lots of readings of Genesis 1. Even from ancient times. This is my point.
And a big thing is that whole in the beginning, right? So that the way that's translated, in the beginning, that's kind of where the ex nihilo comes, is like, in the beginning there's God, then he created, and that's where people get it. I found this interesting, and I don't know a ton about this.
Before you go on, I just got to say, Bereshit literally means like in the head or in the heads. It's this idea, head in the Greek, it's enarche en hologos. Arche is first or chief. So head, what does that even
John
mean?
1.
Yeah, John 1:1. Enarche en hologos. The idea is we're going back. It doesn't say beginning, but it says in the head. So what does that mean?
Yeah.
And so Joseph would say, well, we're talking about the council of the gods.
That's what he says right here. He breaks it down, and he says, when the inspired man wrote it, he did not put the bait. I think he's trying to say bait, B-A-I-T-H there. An old Jew without any authority added the word. He thought it too bad to begin the talk about the head. It read first, the head one of the gods brought forth the gods. That is the true meaning of the words.
Which is what you're
Which
saying.
is in line with the Sefer Bahir. So that's pretty interesting, right?
Like Joseph,
We're talking about the King Follett discourse. Surprise.
we have to do a breakdown.
And by the way, this is not in John Walton's book, bro.
This was not the plan.
We
Dude, this
need
is
to
what I love
break
about
that.
inviting you guys, because we always have a jumping off point, and by the end, we have lost 90% of our viewers. And
We're talking about the NC2A tournament, the Sefer Bahir.
Tofu
Talking about something
Balofu,
completely different.
Hapax Legomenons. But the question I have, and I would love, this would be a really good book. What did Hebrew scholars know at the time of Joseph, and what does Joseph say in the King Follett's discourse? Because, like he's saying these. I'm
Seem way
amazed
ahead of his
every
time.
single time I read the King Follett's discourse. I'm like, how did this guy? And it's so funny because he brings it up right at the end of his life. He's been going for how many years, and it kind of seems like he's like, and he says multiple times, like, if you knew what I knew, or if I told you everything I knew, you would like kill me, or like you would fall apart like glass.
You would fall
know
away.
What I mean? And he just right before he dies, he's kind of like, should I give him a taste? And he puts out this crazy doctrines.
So if you have a manuscript about the American scientific knowledge and rabbinical Hebraic understanding
In Nauvoo.
underpinning the King Follett discourse, reach out to us. I would love to publish your book.
Yeah.
That'd be a great book that 9 people would read.
Yeah.
I would
could
read
sell that to 5,000 people at least.
I would read it.
So one thing I want to point out is in this Tanakh that I have here, the JPS Hebrew English
Hebrew Bible.
Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the translation that he gives to the very beginning isn't in the beginning. He said the way he translates this, whoever did this translation, is when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void with darkness over the surface of the deep, a wind from God sweeping over the water. God said, let there be light. But it's interesting because he says when God began to create, which doesn't like the in the beginning immediately railroads you to be like the very beginning of time where there is just God. And I think that's
And
where
that
a lot
translation
of the
doesn't.
And this one doesn't do that. And what you're saying about the Bereshit isn't it doesn't even like when you break it down, it doesn't even mean in the beginning.
But second century Christians grappled with this, and they really were. We have to remember, and this is another podcast, but they were really swimming in Platonic philosophy, and they had to kind of grapple with what does Christian faith mean, and how does it meld with Christianity. And one of the things these second century thinkers did was they approached highly intellectual Greeks, and they defended Christianity, and they said, we are the true philosophy. If you read Plato, he's talking about what we believe, and they tried to show how they blended, and in so doing, they did some good things, but then they also made some mistakes. And so I don't want to throw them under the bus, but I want to just say, you know what? Aren't we all doing that? We live in culture, we're swimming in it, and sometimes we don't know we're swimming in it, and then we read Scripture, and how do we read it?
So this brings us back very nicely to a point Walton makes early, and this is another point. Again, I think, or maybe this is not again. Maybe I haven't said this on camera yet. If you were going to sort of dip your toe into biblical scholarship and be like, well, I haven't read this stuff, I'm not sure. This is a great one to start with. It's written for the general reader, but he explains in just wonderfully natural language important ideas like how do we understand the meaning of a word. But he also talks about translation. A couple 3 pages, and he says, this is fantastic. So Mike is pointing out the highlighted text. One cannot convey words meaningfully from a source language to a target language without first determining what they think the text means to say.
That's page 48.
Yeah. So Hugh Nibley, in the Message of the Joseph Smith Papyri, a book we may read later on Mike and Dave Read Books. Mm-hmm. Talks about this. He says, if we don't understand what the text says, you haven't really translated it. Translation is not go down the dictionary, this word, this word, this
So
word. True. I don't know what it means, but that's the words, right? Like you have not translated it. You just don't you just changed one gibberish into another gibberish. And he says, hey, it's not just a matter of knowing the words. It is also a matter of understanding the culture.
Idioms.
Idioms. And an example he gives is marriage, right, where he says, if you are reading about the marriage of Abraham and Sarah, or Isaac or Jacob, and you are importing 21st century Western ideas about, for example, romantic love, you're probably not seeing what the authors were seeing in the text, right? Because as much as we might want to believe that those feelings existed between those people, that's not what marriage seems to have meant as a cultural institution, right? So, by the way, another book someone should write, and I would be happy to publish it, is like a cultural atlas of the Nephites, an exploration of Book of Mormon Nephite culture from the text.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah. And by the way, this is the foundation of comedy.
Uh-huh.
Every comic production that I really like has a character who's not quite with the idioms, or maybe it's a foreigner that's learning English, and then they'll use a word the way it says in the dictionary, and everyone's laughing because they're like, you don't know what we know about that word or about that phrase. Does that make sense? And so there's all kinds of characters that do this. To me, it brings to mind the show where we have this guy named Cousin Eddie, and he's always like misusing English, and it's hilarious. But when we're doing translation,
it's not hilarious.
Well,
when it's about eternally significant things.
Yeah, it could be a challenge. But I will say, looking it up in the dictionary and doing the work is useful, because then you'll look at it and you'll go, okay, I'm missing something. And then that's where it's helpful to go to someone who says, tell me about this idiom, or tell me about how is this word understood. And that's where guys like John Walton really shine.
Exactly. And how many sayings do we have that 1,000 years from now people won't understand like what the meaning is? Like I'm trying to think of what are some sayings that we use that you have to know what they mean in order to know what they mean.
Well, I don't know saying, but we were talking about this the other day, the word mystery, like how it's completely lost its original meaning. And
Yes.
stuff like that.
I mean, the answer is actually all of them, right? The answer is actually everything we say.
But also when you're eating some good wings and you're like, this be bussing. Like, people are not going to understand.
This slaps. Yeah, like this. That's a perfect example.
See, I
Like,
don't
this
even know what
slaps.
you're talking
'Cause
about.
You translate that and you live today and you're like, is that good or bad?
Or
You know
like-
what I mean?
Or
And-
sick.
yeah.
Dude, that's sick.
Yes.
Right?
Could that
Yes.
be, because that could be both good and bad depending on the context. And so now rewind 2,500 years, and that's what we're working with.
Sure, but also manners of speech, like a phrase like lock, stock, and barrel, right? Like refers to something actually quite specific, and then acquires sort of a generic
You have to know what a
meaning.
gun is, and
You have to know,
yes.
like, to know what it really means. You have to know what a gun is and the parts of a gun, right?
It's kind of like this thing that we've been listening to recently where someone is saying that maybe there was metalwork inside of the ancient temple.
Yeah.
And unless you understand how metalwork works
Yeah.
in the ancient world, you're going to miss all of these words. But once you realize, oh, this is what it takes in order to cast metal, this is the vocabulary
This means to
associated
refine.
with it.
This means to
then
forge.
then you listen and you read the Bible and you're like, oh my gosh, all of these things have metalworking language associated with them.
Are you guys okay if I jump in with an example?
Yes.
Okay, so it's on page 56 of his book. But he just talks about that God created the firmament to hold the waters above the
I
earth
never understood
from
that.
the earth, essentially. And I love this on page 56. He says, we cannot think that we can interpret the word expanse or firmament as simply the sky or the atmosphere, if that is not what the author meant by it when he used it, and not what the audience back then would have understood by the word. As discussed in chapter 1, we cannot force Genesis to speak to some later science. And that's one thing that I try to do when I teach, is I try to think, okay, what was the intent of the author? I actually try to think of a few things. One of the things I think as a teacher, as a gospel teacher, is I think, okay, first, what does the text actually say? And then I think, what was the intent of the author? And then what are the needs of my students? Like, where are they? Now, in this forum where we're on YouTube, the needs of the students vary. Like, everybody watching this, and us as well, we are all students. We're trying to understand. What verse is that where it talks about the firmament?
It's right here, actually. And this Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, says, God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the water, that it may separate water from water. God made the expanse, and it separated the water which was below the expanse from the water which was above the expanse, and it was so.
Yeah, okay, so in the Latin, the word rakia, which is the Hebrew, was translated as firmamentum.
Rock Yang, if you're reading the Book of Abraham.
Yeah, it's in the Book of Abraham.
Correct.
It is.
Really?
In the facsimiles.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we can go there if you want.
No, do this.
No, really fast. So the rakia, translated in the Latin as firmamentum. And firmamentum gets us the English word firmament. And I remember I was reading Genesis 1 with a friend when I was in high school. I think I was a senior. And I was like really thinking about, okay, in a couple years, I'm going to go on my mission. I might want to read what Genesis actually says, not what other people tell me it says. And I was stumped right here. And I was like, what are the waters above and the waters beneath? And I didn't know. And it like frustrated me. And we had lots of books in my house, and I read stuff and I couldn't find it. And it really
It still bugs me.
It troubled me. And it was years later that I learned that the ancients believed that there was a dome over the earth. They had different ideas of what it was made of. A lot of them thought that it was some kind of metal. Perhaps it was transparent, but they believed that above the dome there was water, because obviously you look up and there's blue up there.
And this is the Egyptian, right? So Nut, the sky goddess, is being held up by Geb, the earth god. They are a married couple. But what is above is water, because the sun, Ra, sails across the sky in a boat, right? And the stars are boats, and they sail across the sky. This is also in the Book of Abraham in the facsimiles. So to put some of these things together, right? So he says we have to understand the culture of the day. And the culture of the day, this was the science of the day, as we are in a bubble inside the primal waters, and there is something holding waters up above us as the earth pushes away the waters below. That is the science of the day. But the science of the day, and in the cultural paradigms of the day, is being used not to tell you this is what God did. He made the bubble inside the earth. No, it's being used to tell you a story about the function,
The purpose
of creation. Why was this stuff made, right? And the first 3 days, I forget how he summarized them. The first day is time. The second day is food. What does he say about the third day? I can't remember.
So if I remember, first day is separating light from darkness.
Which is time.
Yep. And then the second day, the third day is the waters.
Okay.
I have it right here.
So light was good.
I know
first
I underlined this. Hold on.
darkness night.
Yeah, so on day 1, God created the basis for time. Day 2, the basis for weather. Day 3, the basis for food.
Water.
Right. So these are the functionalities of what you need for human life as we know it to exist. And then in days 4, 5, and 6, he sets up the functionaries. There's a really interesting thing about
It's like a repeat, right?
about the whales.
Yeah.
And then he creates man. And we haven't even gotten to what I think is actually the most interesting part, right? Because he says, day 7, God rested, which means what?
Well, the question is, what's the purpose of rest? And then the other question he asks is, okay, what about day 8? But for me, the rest bit, I don't know if this is where you were going, but the idea of the rest is God is at the helm.
Yeah.
God's in charge. He's on his throne, and he's resting, and it doesn't mean he's napping. What does it mean?
On his throne. The argument is that these 6 days are the inauguration of the cosmos as the great temple. And day 7, God rests, means he enters his temple and he sits down on the throne and takes the helm.
So it's more
In
of
the
like
Holy
a
of
mic
Holies.
drop.
In
It's
the
more of
Holy
like
of Holies.
it's like a divine mic drop that he's
It's a
doing.
divine-
He's kind of like, I did this.
It's a temple text. This is the recreation at the temple, and he mentions it was probably yearly, but the idea was...
Including Moshe Weinfeld, who I think we'll probably talk about later.
Moshe Weinfeld's
Another
dope.
time.
Yeah, the idea is that the king takes the throne. The king, he's a sacral king. He's the embodiment. He represents God. He takes the throne in the Holy of Holies. Everybody watches this happen, and the idea is that creation has been renewed. Right. We've entered sacred space and sacred time. God is in control. God is resting, and the idea is that it is an invitation for you as a sacral king to come on God's presence and enter into his rest, which is section
right
84. Now, he's not saying all of this, but he's saying enough of this.
Yeah.
And let me just say something that Mike said, so you don't miss this, okay? Quoting Moshe Weinfeld, he says this is probably a liturgy. So he says, Genesis 1, this is probably an ordinance. It's an ordinance that sets up the existence of the temple and the processes of the earth, the functions of the earth for the benefit of Adam and Eve. And he says it probably happened in the temple. Now, he thinks it happened outside the temple for reasons. I think it happened inside the temple. And that there was a different creation story outside the temple on the Day of Atonement. But Genesis 1 is a temple text. He also connects it to the Garden of Eden, right? And says the temple is the cosmos and the temple is Eden. And again, remember, his point is Therefore, you don't need to think that it needs to be consistent with every new generation of science. It's not about science. It's not
not
trying
about
to
the
tell
Big
you where
Bang.
the physical world came from. It's trying to show you the purpose of temples and temples being built and telling you that God is in charge and the cosmos is created for you.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm thinking about this. My mind is being blown here. If you were to break Genesis
And let
down
us
into like a liturgy, go ahead.
Not a Mormon.
Yeah, the guy's
Okay.
not LDS at all.
What is he? What religious affiliation?
Clearly Christian, I would assume some kind of evangelical.
Yeah. So this is what's crazy. So like think about it, the person that's playing God, whoever the priest is that plays God,
Yeah, or the king.
or the king or whatever, goes through the whole creation of the earth, and then on the seventh day he rests. So what if it is something that happens on the outside of the temple, and then on the seventh day when he rests, then the person that acts as God goes and sits in the Holy of Holies? Then you have the Adam and Eve story, and the person does kind of the procession all the way down to see where God is now resting on his throne.
Something like that might be the case.
It's
There's-
blowing my mind that
we
I'm
have
like,
to reconstruct their ordinances because
Yes.
they never tell them.
I know, because they're supposed to be passed down from generation to generation, and maybe they were in
And
some
maybe they
degree.
were.
And so I find
It's like,
this
for
so
example, if you hear
interesting.
that a bunch of people start singing a song that goes with "Jose, can you see?" It could be "Jose, can you see?" or it could be "Oh, say, can you see?" And but once again, you're reading that they're singing, but there's a whole bit of stuff that's happening there. Their hands are in certain places. There's certain material on a pole that's doing stuff. Do you know what I mean? They're standing, but this is all stuff. It doesn't say in "Oh, say, can you see?" what to do.
Yeah.
Right?
Dude, what there needs to be some sort of, and there probably is a book. I need to find a book on when did it become knowledge that the Adam and Eve story was probably temple liturgy. Like when was
That is a good question. I don't know who's first. The connection between Eden and the temple. I don't know. But probably 19th century.
I can search it out, like, obviously, because this is where I'm swimming right now with my dissertation. But Lundquist has written, John Lundquist, who is LDS, has written a ton about this. But he's quoting other scholars that are saying this before him. So, you know what?
because like Joseph Smith,
if you text me, I will look that up.
Because this is what happens. People say, "Oh, there are similarities between some of the actions in the temple to Freemasonry," but then you look into Freemasonry, you're like, "Yeah, but the story isn't." There's no. It's a secular thing that Freemasonry is a secular.
The murder of Hiram
ordinance,
Abiff,
right? And then it's like, where did Joseph get the idea to put the Genesis story in the temple?
From the Book of Mormon, bro.
Yes, so there's that, but also, and that is made clear in the language of Adam.
Correct. If you don't have your copy, you can acquire it at any good book retailer.
It's on
And you should.
Amazon. It's
Yes.
really good.
That is true.
But where did Joseph Smith get this idea? And that's why I'm so curious. Was this being talked about by biblical scholars, or is Joseph? And this is where I land with so many things. Either biblical scholars have to revere Joseph Smith because he was 100 years ahead of his time when it came to the scholarship on the Deuteronomist, when it came to the scholarship maybe on the temple in Genesis, or they have to revere him because he's a prophet of God. But it doesn't seem like he leaves much room for anything else.
Well, what they end up doing is just ignoring him. But what I want to know is the reason. So guys like John H. Walton, I just looked him up. It doesn't say his religious denomination that he affiliates with, just being a Christian. But is the only reason that modern day evangelicals dismiss a need for temple worship is because of like that verse that says the veil in the temple was rent, that we no longer needed the house of God? Because obviously Jesus, he reveres the temple, and
I've come to fulfill the prophets, right? I mean, there are other verses, but yeah, there are some verses in the New Testament that on that basis.
will not destroy. But yeah.
So, Jack, I just got back. I'm not trying to flex, but I'm gonna flex really quick.
Flex,
I just
bro.
got back from Greece for 2 weeks.
Bro, we
And
need to
flex.
go on that.
Yeah, and we
That
went.
would be an epic
I want you
Sticky
guys to
Joseph
come.
episode, man.
It would be dope. Yeah, and by the way, you
That's
could do
gonna
some
go
good stuff because
down
people would watch your faces on YouTube. But we went to all these places, and the way it works is, as a Latter-day Saint guide, I talk about Jesus, I talk about Paul, I put it in the context of, okay, as Latter-day Saints, how do we navigate this? How do we understand this? And we had a local guide who is Greek Orthodox, and at the conclusion of the tour, she turned to me and she said, I have never had an experience like this. Every place we went to, you are quoting the Old Testament, showing me how it matters. And she says, I was always raised with the Old Testament doesn't even matter because Jesus fulfilled it. And she's Orthodox and she goes to church and she says, I've never even heard anything like this.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, because why does the Old Testament matter? Because it matters to, I don't have my Book of Mormon, because it matters to the guys who wrote the Book of Mormon and the people who wrote the New Testament. The Old Testament was their text. That was the scriptures. So,
or something like the Old Testament, as Jonah Barnes has written, forthcoming.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dude, and so here's a question I have is, and Jackson alluded to it, Jesus in his last week is going and cleansing the temple. And he makes a point to say, you guys have corrupted this thing. He doesn't say, oh, this doesn't matter anymore because I'm about to die and resurrect and fulfill everything. He makes a point to say, you guys have corrupted this, and then just leaves it there. And so Jesus obviously revered the temple. He spent time in the temple. It says he spent time in the temple as a youth. He spent time teaching around the temple and and then cleansing it in the last week. But it's just because the veil rent that they're like.
But the New Testament ends with temple imagery. The end of the Book of Revelation is the return of the cube, the Holy of Holies.
Well, so I'm reading a commentary on Revelation right now that's a little bit comical on this point, and I won't identify the writer. But basically, all the Book of Revelation is set in a temple. Like, it is. It's set in, like, literally, okay? And his explanation for this, he constantly wants to explain that this is a metaphor. Oh, it's a metaphor for the community. It's like he can't accept the possibility that actually the temple is meaningful to John the Beloved or John of Patmos, or right, to Jesus or to Christians. Like, that clearly can't be true, right? Therefore, I have to think of some other reason, and the answer is the temple is a metaphor for the community or something else, right?
Yeah.
It's mental gymnastics. Clearly, the temple was important. Clearly, the Old Testament was important.
Wow.
Well, then also probably they get some of this from First Corinthians 6. Let me just pull it up here.
Okay. We're like trying to reconstruct somebody else's
trying to
point.
figure out
I'm trying to
where this argument
understand.
comes from.
So First
And we should be clear,
6.
like clearly for John Walton, Genesis 1 matters. So
And by the way, while you're looking that up, since Genesis 1 matters and there's a little bit of space, I just want to say this. Joseph Smith teaches this in the temple, but this is on page 69 right out of his book, Back to the Temple. And I'm not going to read the whole bit, but he says, in Genesis 1, all humans, all men and women, fit under Genesis 3:19's edict. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. And then John drops this. He says, it is an archetypical feature that describes us all. It is an how do I say that word?
archetypal.
Archetypal. It is an archetypal feature that describes us all. Adam is an archetype. Mm-hmm. And then he says, it is not a statement just about Adam and Eve. It's a statement about you.
Because you are Adam and Eve.
You are Adam. And one of the first things they tell you in the temple is, we're going to watch this story about Adam and Eve. You're Adam, sisters, you're Eve. And to John Walton, he says, this matters. This is a story that matters. It's a story that's in the temple. So now we're to
And
you.
also,
I just wanted to make sure we got
let's
that.
stay on
supposed to
that,
be that.
right? Because he says, the dust is an archetypal feature and cannot be viewed as a material ingredient. In other words, the point is, you're Adam and Eve, and the point is, that doesn't mean that you're dust, but your functionality, right? This is all about functionality, is the functionality of Adam and Eve. Yeah,
That's
right.
interesting.
The processes you go through are the processes Adam and Eve go through.
Well, I just share this because this was used on my mission when talking to Brazilian evangelicals and talking about the temple.
It is indicative of human destiny.
Oh, okay.
which is the
Mic
temple.
drop.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
amazing.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's good. This was one of the arguments that was used against having the temple be an important part of modern reverence to God. It says in
You have to talk in the mic.
yeah. It says in 1 Corinthians 6:19-20, it says, what? Know ye not your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which ye have of God, and ye are not your own, for ye are bought with a price. And so basically I've heard a lot of evangelicals couple that scripture of the veil being rent with this one. It's like, we don't even need temples. Our bodies are temples now. And they're temples of the Holy Spirit.
And they are.
Yes. Two. And that's how it's been since the beginning.
They always were.
They always were.
And the cosmos is a temple.
Yeah.
And the cosmos corresponds with the building, with the body. Yeah.
Josephus says that in Antiquities.
There's a three-part space right
He
there.
says the temple is the cosmos, and the cosmos is the temple. And then a guy by the name of Hugh Nibley wrote a book called Temple and Cosmos, where he talks about that's where we get our bearings.
Interesting.
So it's all like level. It's once again turtles all the way down. It's layers on a cake.
But when it comes to the temples, it could be a three-part, like three different types of temples. There's the temple of the cosmos, the temple of the physical thing, and then the temple of us.
The
There's
temple
three.
in heaven.
Yes. And so it's just like, wow. Well, this is amazing. We could probably go on forever. The first book, The Lost World of Genesis 1 by John Walton. If you want to get it, you can get it in the description. And next time we'll have another book that will not be reviewed, but whatever we end up calling this. So please give us
We'll probably
a
just
title.
read the title at the beginning and then talk about something totally different.
Unless you give us unequivocal evidence that you hated this, and then we won't do it again.
Awesome. Well, until next time, stay curious and hungry.